the Muhammad Abdul Rahman Chair for Secular Studies in organizing this seminar of India Against Intolerance. I'm honored to be here. I have come here to talk about specifically communalism in Indian cinema. But then I asked the sponsors, I would like to widen the scope beyond cinema. And thankfully they agreed to let me widen this. Let me start with cinema first. Let me take the example of the Kashmir Files. This is the tragic and harrowing story of the departure of a people who had to leave their ancestral homelands in fear of an Islamic uprising that threatened their very existence. They were Hindu Kashmiris. And the story is tragic. It is true. What the filmmaker ignored in this saga was a much larger picture in which the Kashmiri people, both Hindu and Muslim, went through horrifying and traumatic times. There was a cause, there was an effect, and then things spiraled out of control. It all started with a botched up and rigged election in Kashmir. This is a fact. It is rigged because it was not going the way that the state government in Kashmir or the central government in Delhi wanted it to go. So when the people protested, they were tortured and suppressed. The democratic process had been subverted. This is a fact. This was when the insurrection began. 3 years of anger and mayhem, torture and reprisals, chilling Islamic slogans being screamed in the night, games being played by the intelligence agencies of both India and Pakistan, militants coming from across the border to slaughter and to terrorize, the militants within the valley, and the CRPF Jawans trying to counterattack. And in this, innocent Kashmiris being caught in the crossfire. There was hell to pay for 3.5 years, slaughter, mayhem, death. I was there. I was there. This is when the Kashmiri Hindus departed. So when the Indian army was called in after 3.5 years to quell this insurrection, that's when the Kashmiri Pandits left the valley. In all of this, the human cost has been enormous. According to the Kashmiri Pandit Sangharsh Samiti, hundreds of Hindus died in the first few years of the insurrection, and about 300,000 Hindus have left their histories behind. They've gone away. This is the truth. The price paid by the Kashmiri Muslims during the same period was much, much higher. And today, more than 40,000 Kashmiri Muslims have died. Hundreds of thousands have fled to other parts of India and around the world. This is the truth. This is what happened. Did the filmmaker understand this reality also? But that was not his agenda. That was not his agenda. He didn't want to understand this total reality. It was a specific truth he was talking about. And what is this truth? That the Hindus are still suffering at the hands of barbaric Muslims in independent India. That is his agenda. Just like they did in history. History and the great game being played. That is the game. This is what provides justification for what is happening today. And this is the history I'm going to talk about. Many of you will be aware of it, but it needs to be reiterated in our scoundrel times. What is this history? It is a story of an ancient and great civilization that flourished in peace and harmony for thousands of years, until a barbaric band of invaders entered this land and raped and plundered this civilization, stunted its growth for over 1,000 years. And it is only now that this civilization is slowly recovering its past glory, and it is now on the journey to becoming a beacon for the rest of the world. It is a story of a very superior people, laid low by savages with no history, no civilization. This is what they're talking about. This is what fascism is all about. You have to have the other, barbaric, savage, no civilization. This is what fascism is really all about. This was a narrative spun by the colonial Raj that came to power in the subcontinent. What they said basically was that the earlier rulers were fundamentally outsiders, bigots, and rapacious looters. This narrative was dutifully picked up by sections of newly emerging Indian scholarship in Western institutions during that period. By the early 20th century, this narrative got a major boost by right-wing organizations. And when the country was finally divided on religious lines, very painfully divided on religious lines, the trauma set off reinforced this narrative. And today, this history has been very seamlessly weaponized and made lethal by fascists who have been masquerading as patriots. It is an ideal weapon. It demonizes a religion and its followers. It divides the country into us and them, the patriots and the fifth columnists. And most importantly, it allows for retribution. Payback time today for the sins of the past, with no remorse, no guilt, no shame. This is the narrative. And I object to it. I am not an academic or a historian, but I have a deep and lasting interest in the study of history, and this kind of history is an insult to my intelligence. Besides, it is also a big lie. And let me tell you why and how. There were hundreds of kingdoms in India before the coming of the conquering Turks. Empires that rose and fell. And now a question that needs to be asked. How did one empire or kingdom give way to another? Was it over a cup of tea and biscuits? Or the spilling of blood? How do empires change? Chai पीने के बाद के handshake जाइए take over, or they killed. How does it happen? Slaughter occurs, blood is spilt, empires change. This is the truth. There's enough evidence in early and contemporary Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain literature to tell you there were wars, carnage, plundering, and desecration. There was a lot of spilling of blood as empires changed and kingdoms collapsed. One shudders at the thought of Ashoka's rise to power. He killed 99 of his first cousins to come to the throne. The carnage of warriors like Pushyamitra and Shashank wreaked. It's all there, documented. Of the mayhem recorded in the Mahabharata. Hindu kingdoms fought against other Hindu kingdoms, Shaivas against Vaishnavites, and also against Buddhist and Jain empires. This is the truth. Yes, there was bigotry too. Places of worship were destroyed, and people were killed because of their faiths. There is a famous classic story of a king offering a bounty for every Buddhist head that was slaughtered. We shouldn't lie to ourselves about our past. Let's face it, this is how empires happen. But does it make us not a great civilization? Of course we are a great civilization. A great civilization of ideas and philosophies, but we also spilled blood. This is also true. The treatises by the wily Chanakya will tell you what to do in times of war. Chanakya was a great exponent of what is to be done to stay in power, how to destroy, how to kill, how to murder, how to change an empire, how to retain power. He tells it all. That's Chanakya. He was talking to an audience. Who was the audience? Yes, the past is not as tranquil as is made out to be. I shall now come to the barbarous invaders. What is not revealed is that Islam came into India through ancient trade routes and took several hundred years. It took root for several hundred years before the Turks stormed in from the north. The religion flourished all along the western and eastern coasts of India. Gujarat, Konkan, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, Odisha, all along. And even they developed a language called Arabic, which is a combination of Tamil, Persian, Arabic, and Malayalam, a language created for trade, to talk to each other. This was there. Also important to note is one of the oldest mosques in the world was built in Kerala at the time of the Prophet. 600 years before those fellows stormed in from the north, the Turks came in from the north with the sword. It is also all here. This is the truth. Now we come to the Turkic invaders. They must have been a barbaric lot, I'm sure. Let's see how barbaric they were. Yes, they did destroy temples. They came as iconoclasts and they behaved as such. Were they biased towards people of their own faith? Of course they were. Can you imagine the earlier civilization being democratic and just? However, what is to be remembered is that these new conquerors, to establish their authority, mainly destroyed those edifices that were symbols that represented the earlier rulers. It was not indiscriminate destruction. It was just common sense. Ask yourself a question. Would these invaders be able to rule for more than 300 years if they went about desecrating every Hindu shrine where more than 95% of the satraps and subjects were linked to that religion? How could they rule for 350 years? It's not possible. It's stupid to believe that. Eminent and world-renowned historians have come to the same conclusion. Historians like Richard Eaton, D.N. Jha, Irfan Habib will tell you this story. This is the truth. The purveyors of faults, once, however, these new rulers established themselves, things began to change. As they made alliances with Hindu kings and chieftains, they had Hindu administrators, most importantly, financiers. And their own scholars, doctors, scribes, musicians, administrators, historians, poets, and architects, and Sufis began to mingle and to learn from this ancient land. It was an incredible land too, in fact, to learn from. The purveyors of these false narratives would never reveal that these barbaric invaders also had a great deal of talent in their midst. But they did. Ancient Hindu texts on mathematics, astronomy, like those of Aryabhat and Brahmagupta, began to be translated and studied. Has anybody heard of a man called Al-Biruni? He was there. He was translating. Have you heard of Amir Khusro? He was there. He was translating. The Jataka tales, the Buddhist Jataka tales. And those tales were admired for their sheer ingenuity. Persian tales and epics and the medical treatises of Ibn Sina and Al-Razi were also introduced into Indian medicine. Texts of mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Kindi entered into the discourse. Songs began to be sung together. Festivals celebrated together. And would love and poetry be far behind? Yes, as much as this civilization honored war and valor, it celebrated love, literature, and poetry too. Yes, this civilization was not so barbaric as it made out to be. Along with these interactions, and over time, a new color was being added to a large existing canvas. Syncretic is happening. As with all empires, these new entrants also fought among themselves, and dynasties changed. The Tughlaqs to the slaves, to the Khiljis, to the Lodhis, they all happened among themselves. But what is also important to note, they stopped the Mongols from entering India. The Mongol horde were coming in. They stopped them at the border of the Hindu Kush, the Khiljis. And then they also suffered at the hands of Taimur, another invader and conqueror. They suffered slaughter, and death. It also happened. Both Muslim armies fighting the Delhi Sultanate. So who was fighting whom? This is the truth. This is history. Finally, the children of Babur arrived. They called them Babur ki aulad. This was the term used by the purveyors of false history to describe the Mughal Empire. The question is, who did the Mughals really fight? Yes, Babur did fight a few Rajput kings, but their biggest battles were against the Muslim Afghans, the earlier rulers. All through the reign of the Mughals till the time of Aurangzeb, their greatest enemies were other Muslim kings in Gujarat, in Sindh, Punjab, Kandahar, Kabul, Malwa, Muslim usurpers in Bengal and Bihar. What is important to note? That it was a Muslim, Mughal and a Hindu Rajput alliance that created this empire. Muslim Mughals, Hindu Rajputs created this empire. This is a fact. Through marriages and alliances and children. As this empire grew, so did translations of ancient Indian and Persian texts and philosophies. The stories of young Lord Krishna and his escapades began to be celebrated in song and music. And the Vedas and the Upanishads were being translated and studied. Persian texts and tales of love and valor like Shri Farhad and Sorab and Rustum were introduced to Indian audiences too. All this is happening in my country. As we move to the south, the biggest obstacle to Mughal expansion is the Deccan Sultanate. Other Muslims, whose commanders and chiefs were either Abyssinian slaves or Maratha or Andhra commanders. This is India, this is history. To these kingdoms, the Mughals were the outsiders, and over more than 300 years, from the 14th to the 17th centuries, a distinct Persian, Andhra and Maratha culture was taking shape in the Deccan. To them, the Mughals were the outsiders. Let me tell you the tale of one warrior that says it all. One tale. There was a commander called Maloji Bhonsle. Has anybody heard of him? Maloji Bhonsle? I'll tell you about him. He was the commander, Maratha commander under the Abyssinian Sultan called Malik Ambar. Does anyone know that the two were brilliant warriors and perfected the art of guerrilla warfare as they confronted the armies of the Mughal armies of Jahangir? Malik Ambar, Maloji Bhonsle confronting the armies of the Mughals of Jahangir, and the armies are led by Jai Singh, a Rajput. Mughal armies led by a Rajput general. Muslim army is being led by a Maratha and an Abyssinian slave. Can you see it? Can you understand what is happening? Does anybody know that the same Maloji Bhonsle, this great commander, he goes to the mausoleum of a Sufi saint to pray for male children. The Sufi saint's name is Shahji and Sharifji. Shah Sharif, that's the name of the Sufi saint. So Maloji Bhonsle goes and prays, and he has two sons, and he names them Shahji, Sharifji, after the name of the saint, Shah Sharif. Shahji is the father of Shivaji, the great warrior. Come on. Shahaji is the father of Shivaji, Chhatrapati Shivaji, the great Maratha warrior. And Shahaji himself was a commander under the Bijapur and Mughal empires till the day he died. Am I making sense to you all? Unfortunately, I'm speaking in English. I wish I was speaking Malayalam to get my point across, to hammer it through. Yes, the Muslim Mughals did fight the Muslim sultans, but so many of the commanders were Hindus. The Muslim sultans fought the Muslim Mughals, and so many of the commanders were Hindus too. To add to this confusion, many Hindu kings had Muslim commanders and soldiers in the army, so who was fighting whom? Prithviraj Chauhan fighting Akbar, Battle of Haldighati. He has an army of 3,000 troops. His commander is an Afghan. His commander is an Afghan, and he's got 1,000 Afghan troops in his army of 3,000. 1,000 Afghan troops. Prithviraj Chauhan fighting Akbar. Does anybody know this history? Does anybody understand this history? The question that needs to be asked to these purveyors of false histories: why have they left these little details aside? Whose purpose does it serve? And who benefits from it? Who benefits from this false history? As an aside, I'd like to add that the numerous wives and concubines and harems are supposed to be of the Mughals. What is not known is, not a great many Marathas, Andhra, Rajput, Sikh and Maratha king had wives, number of wives and harems too. Chhatrapati Shivaji had 6 wives. Did you know that? But does it make him less of a warrior? He was a great warrior and a great ruler, that's true. But he also had 6 wives. Our great ruler in Delhi today, he is of a family that has 6 children himself. His family comprises 6 brothers and sisters. Mr. Narendra Modi, he talks about population control. This man, what are we talking about? But let me tell you what the influence of Islam really did, which is incredibly important. 2 basic things. 2 basic things. The first is that it completely undermined the role of Sanskrit as a power base. Language. In the north. Language. More important than that was the rapid expansion of vernacular languages. Hindi, Braj Bhasha, Khadi Boli, Awadhi, Bengali, Gujarati, Dakkani, Urdu, Marathi, Telugu, Kannada. Other languages are taking shape and form and coming to the surface. The practitioners of high culture would be aghast by this subaltern intrusion. ये क्या है, कौन सी ज़बान है? But it's coming. Then the other, second important is the rise of the Bhakti and Sufi traditions. That at their core, these traditions criticized the mindless rituals and pompousness and hypocrisy of clerics and priests, both Hindu and Muslim. That's what they did. The Sufi and Bhakti traditions. Now imagine these people being ridiculed and made fun of. After centuries of glorification and impunity, they are being criticized. Pehli baar, they're being criticized. I will quote a Punjabi Sufi poet called Bulle Shah, and I will translate it for you. He said, "Abey, O Brahman, when you ring the bell of your temple, you will not find God. Abey, O Sheikh, you pray 5 times a day, you won't find God either. Teri niyat hai khoti, your intentions are unquestionable. I danced, I sang, I made a friend, I reached God." That's Sufism. The Bhakti tradition. Basav, here in Kerala, Narayan Guru. It's all happening. It's all extensions of an argument. They're all extensions of the same argument that I'm making today. Having said this, I must go back to my story about empires. After the death of Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire began to falter, and the order was giving rapidly to the rise of the Marathas and the sacking of Delhi by Nadir Shah. That was the culmination, 1740. The Mughal Empire had been hollowed out, emptied. It did not exist after 1740. The big guns were the Marathas, the British, and later on the Sikhs. There were also some reviving Rajputs, Gujars, Jats, and the Sultans in Bengal and Bihar, and the kingdom of the south. What is also to be remembered, from 1740 onwards, the economic decline of India began, where from the around 25% of the GDP, we came down to 3% in 1947. Incredible. So was Mughal rule perfect? No, it wasn't perfect. Were there cases of intolerance and bigotry? I'm sure there were. Of course there happened to be. No, nobody's perfect. And feudalism is never perfect. It can never be democratic and never can be just. You require a constitution to be just and fair and democratic. They had no constitution. But therefore, the ideas of 750 years of history of Muslims on one side and Hindus on the other is an insult to my intelligence. The idea that only Muslims can be violent and cruel and plunder and kill is also an insult to my intelligence. The idea that Hindus are non-violent and peaceful and is garbage. Hammam mein sab nange hain. Everybody is naked in the public bath. They all plundered, they all killed, this is a fact. Now, most important, these invaders never left. They're still here, they're buried all over the country. They're buried right here. Kings and emperors, scholars and poets, historians and architects, doctors, scribes, warriors, singers, painters, musicians, Sufis and mystics. Generations upon generations, they gave us a testament to the simple truth. Yes, they did destroy. Of course they did destroy. It's the truth. They did. But they also built. They also created. They built exquisite monuments and palaces, public buildings and later gracious cities. They built courts, hospitals, markets, caravanserais and ports for trade and enriched the land with music, literature and tales, food, language, dress codes, poetry, architecture, and gardens. This is our history. This is our history, warts and all. It is a history that has quite a bit of poetry in it. Quite a bit of stupidity and brutality also. And also quite a bit of wisdom. But this is our history, and this is our counter-narrative that should be taught in schools all over the country. This is what we need to teach younger generations across the land. This is what is required. Now, these election results have proved something very simple, that this message of distorted history and hate, religious hate, does have an expiry date. It is slowly but surely being reduced in power and influence. But, and this is a big but, the results in Kerala should be a wake-up call. The rising percentage points in Tamil Nadu, results in Andhra and Telangana, also a wake-up call. History has proved that bigots, fascists, and purveyors of hate can always resurrect themselves in times of political and economic distress. And for that, we have to be extremely vigilant and prepared to confront these forces wherever they are. Thank you.